In this lesson, we're looking at cell division, or more importantly, the cell cycle control of cell division. Okay, these are our dot points that we have not yet covered. All the other dot points are covered off in our video called mitosis. All right, our cell cycle, remember, looks like this, and it's got the interphase section and the mitosis section. And what's controlling it are proteins called cyclins. Okay, they are in charge of making sure that the cell cycle either progresses or doesn't progress because of a certain reason. All right, so that's their only job. Okay, and they must reach a certain concentration before the cell can progress. So, for example, in order for a cell to get out of G phase, we need to have, say, a very high level of this particular protein and a very high level of that particular protein, not so much the S cyclin or the M cyclin there. So it's about the balance of where these are at, and obviously the cell must be able to produce them, and if they can't produce them in a certain amount of concentration or a certain quantity, obviously the cell is not quite ready for mitosis. Now, cyclins work via a domino effect. This is quite a complex picture, but really what it does is simplify down a very, very complex situation. And when I say the domino effect, it's a bit of a cascade of events. As one thing happens, it's going to lead to another one and another one and another one. The very first part of this is that cyclins bind to enzymes called kinases, okay? And what they do is they activate them. So in this particular section, what they're doing is activating those kinases. They also then go on to attach phosphates to other proteins, all right, to activate them. Those other proteins then do their role in either progressing or arresting the cell cycle. So when I say domino effect, it's because the cyclins aren't just doing it on their own, they are leading the charge to do all the things, to basically call to arm to all the other proteins to do their job. Now, problems with cell cycle can arise if the cell cycle arrests. When I say arrest, I mean it's stopped, right? Arrested development means it's development that has stopped. If cells are not biologically ready to move on past certain checkpoints in the cell, it just won't happen. So in this particular diagram, we're showing, all right, we're progressing all the way through G1, our first phase of interphase, but actually at this checkpoint, we're going to check, do we have enough nutrients? Do we have the right growth factors? Do we have any DNA damage? If we go on to mitosis with DNA damage, that means we're going to start to replicate a cell that's just abnormal. So we don't want to do that. So the cell has these checkpoints to stop it. And that can actually happen. And the cell will go off into G0 stage or G0. So it's a resting state. It means it's not going to do its function properly, but it's not really going to move on to replication either. So it's not doing that preparation. On the flip side of that, cell division can actually happen in an uncontrolled manner. And what happens is maybe those checkpoints are pushed straight through and they go, yeah, it's all fine. We're not going to listen to you, checkpoint. We're just going to go straight into that mitosis phase. And the cell cycle will go round and round and round and not stop. What happens then is that, say, potentially all this, or we'll just go back one, cells can divide and divide and divide, and suddenly we've got a whole heap of them in this tiny little area. And that's what we usually know as a tumor. Okay, tumours can be benign, which means they're harmless, they're just normal cells and there's just a lot of them uncontrollably growing, or they can be malignant, and that's when we talk about cancerous cells. Now, in normal cell division, if there is an actual damaged cell, or say the DNA is not quite right, the cell can go, you know what, we've noticed this at the checkpoint, we're actually going to, it's called controlled cell death. We're going to kill off this cell, essentially, apoptosis. However, in the cancer cell, it's potential that that checkpoint is not listened to, and that abnormal cell is replicated and multiplied many, many, many times, and then suddenly you have this whole big section of cells in this one area that they shouldn't be, and they're starting to change the morphology or the shape of the other cells around it and maybe stretch that tissue and basically disrupt everything around it. Carcinogens are things that can cause that mutation in the DNA. It can cause a base sequence change, which can change the instructions that the DNA are giving, okay? And those instructions might be just ignore the checkpoint, just keep going, or it can lead to switching off the controls that would usually stop or slow down that. Now, Group 1 carcinogens, things we know a lot about. So smoking, exposure to solar radiation, alcoholic beverages, processed meats, all those kinds of things you hear a lot about. And there's a lot of scare tactics to them, but generally they fit into 3 categories. So chemical, physical, or biological. Chemical might be those chemicals in cigarettes. Physical might be the sun and the radiation that the sun is giving out, or, you hear a lot of scary reports about your mobile phones giving out lots of radiation. And biological, we might talk about a virus or a particular infection mutation that lead you down that path. So for example, the HPV virus, we immunize against that because it's known to cause cervical cancer. So some propaganda back in the day, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes, and to keep a slender figure, no one can deny, have one of these kind of cigarettes. We look back and we laugh at those kinds of things, but in actual fact, back in the day, they either didn't know that these things were carcinogens, or when they did, they kind of downplayed the problems with them. And getting cancer is about accumulating those cancerous changes. So you might find, say, if you have a family history, you're standing on the first step of a staircase and you've got one factor that might lead you down the path of a cancerous change. You might then smoke, and that means you're adding those carcinogens in, and you can take a step up. And oncogenes are a section of DNA which, if mutated, can potentially lead to cancerous changes. It doesn't mean they always will, but it has the potential to. Cells need multiple mutations or multiple changes or problems to occur to lead to that cancerous change. So if you know you've got a gene that's hereditary, that's passed down through your family, that's a problem, and you're smoking and you're out in the sun, all those kinds of things start to accumulate and can cause a lot of problems in your cells. All right, so there are all our dot points. We've covered quite a lot just in this topic 1.6. So please make sure you go back and watch or read in your textbook.